This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our August 28th Monday Strategic Overview. I'll be joined with Michael Steger, and the topic of our discussion and dialogue for tonight is going to be in the central banking system before it ends us. Obviously, there is a lot going on, but when you think about it, the question of the collapse of the U.S. economy, the question of the continued push by the British imperial oligarchy to destroy the United States, including their fascist moves to stop the election of President Donald Trump, is being pushed back on by the American people in ways that you could have never imagined. We are in a revolutionary period right now. And I think what Michael put out in the statement announcing this meeting tonight is very prevalent and very important. As said, the question is whether it is inflation, war, drugs, mass immigration, cheap labor, mass debt, crime, destruction of culture. These are the intended effects of the global central banking system to rape, pillage, and plunder. This is the modern form of imperialism, and there is no longer time or energy for any pretense otherwise. So once again, after five decades of total control of the global finance by this private banking cartel, we face an unavoidable global economic and population collapse, cultural destruction, and world war. And when you think about the idea and the image of Satan coming to steal, kill, and destroy, that is what you see happening right now under the guise of this globalist, imperial, British Empire system, but is backfiring on them because the American people are saying no more, get behind thee, Satan. It's not going to happen. When we see that you have those who are pushing to stop the election of President Trump, pushing with these insane investigations, these indictments that are going on, and you have a growing movement that is emerging that's looking at the conditions of the living standard of the population, the almost collapse of the US dollar, where you have if you look at our website, larouchepac.com, I do want to point out to you that we just put out, just make sure I can, here we go, share this real quick. This very important statement, two very important statements on our website. Load here. First one, as if you can see here, is a report on, and I'm sure Michael will go through this a little bit more in his remarks, but high from above Jackson Hole. Jackson Hole, Wyoming is where the Federal Reserve, the central bankers just held their meeting. The title of the article just written by Brian Lance and posted on our website, High from Above Jackson Hole, the real choice is Trump or Dope Inc. And I would encourage people to go and read this report. It is very hard-hitting as it discusses the fact that the central bankers led by the European Central Bank leader, Christine Lagarde, as well as the U.S. Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, made clear that they will continue to raise interest rates, that they have to keep inflation is continuing to be higher and higher. And the only way that you're going to deal with that is not by addressing the productive economy and building up the economy, but it's by printing more money, making inflation high, making it hard for people to live, people to buy houses, people to have food, get gas, everything else. And I'm thinking about what was really expressed in a discussion we had this past Saturday. You can find that on our website with Bruce Director and Dan Leach. And when you think about this idea as it's expressed in this revolutionary concept of Rise like lions after sleep and slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew when in sleep had fallen on you. We are many, they are few. And that's what's emerging in the population. I think Percy Shelley would have never seen a revolutionary period like this one, even in his time. The wake up, the American people, the MAGA movement, the America First movement, and those who are joining in that, from the Arab population to the Black population, Hispanics, are rallying not just around Trump, but rallying around our fight for our republic, for our Constitution. And you're seeing this revolutionary spirit emerging, and the population, the people of America, awaken like never before. And that's what we're going to discuss tonight. I would encourage people to, if you're listening to this call on YouTube after the fact, we would love your comments, and we'll be willing to answer any questions that you have. We encourage people to sign up to join us on these calls live, so you can join the discussion after the opening remarks. Otherwise, I would definitely encourage people. The other article that we have on our website is Beyond BRICS. And as people know, just a few days before the Jackson Hole meeting of the Fed and central bankers and so forth, you had the BRICS nations getting together. And one thing that's been made clear, clearly stated, that no other country is going to, countries coming together in a camaraderie or whatever you want to call it, are going to be able to do anything without the fight being won in the United States. So people know that earlier today, it was announced that the President Trump's hearing has been put forth in terms of the federal hearing, and this is being scheduled, currently being stated as being scheduled around the same time, at the same time as the start of Super Tuesday. So this is going to cause uproar. And the question is, as Michael says, the victory is not going to be won without the election of President Donald Trump, and nothing can get in the way of that happening. The American people have to fight back. So that's what I wanted to open with. And then I want to go ahead and let me stop the share here and go ahead and turn it over to Michael for his comments, and then we'll go ahead and continue the discussion with you after.
Excellent. Thanks, Keisha. So we're going to jump into this question of the central banking system tonight. As many of you know, we have called for ending the Federal Reserve, but ours is not a libertarian campaign, which simply wants to end the Fed, maybe go back to a gold or silver-backed dollar for domestic purposes. We want to establish a different kind of banking system, and I'm going to try to get at why that's so important. But last week, we said that it's absolutely critical that we shut down this Republican primary debate, and that we move the House Republican caucus to take immediate action when they come back September 12th to wage war upon the DOJ and these prosecutions of Trump. Now, I think as many of you know, both McCarthy, the Speaker, and Jim Jordan have come out and said that there will almost inevitably be hearings to consider impeaching Joe Biden. Trump has responded and says, what do you mean consider? Just impeach the guy. I didn't get any consideration in the House. I didn't get any inquiries. Now, some of this is warranted, as all of us know. And yet, having discussions on Joe Biden is not really the greatest threat to this enemy, but it may become part of an overall assault. And in that sense, all pressure on all points that can be waged effectively are useful, but that's not the priority. But something has developed today. Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia who's on the House Appropriations Committee, which is probably the most powerful committee in the House. It's where the money's spent. And this is a defunding. He's talking about 2 rider bills that would go on in one of the 12 appropriation bills. So there's the House rules, just to put some context into this, the House rules that were fought over by the Freedom Caucus, by Matt Gaetz and Chip Roy and others in January, that allowed McCarthy to become speaker. It was the compromise, broke up that instead of an omnibus budget bill, I guess there's now going to be 12 budget bills broken up into categories. I thought it was less, but I think it's now 12. So the Senate may pass an omnibus bill, but the House is going to pass separate bills. And then, of course, if you don't know, what happens is then these things go to conference where some people of the House and some members of the Senate get together and they pull together what the budget is going to be. I don't know what pressure the House can put on the Senate to pass separate bills. So all of this is like internal procedure. And as one person once said, if you take policy and I get procedure, I will kill you every time in Congress. So a lot of this is parliamentary procedural warfare that has to be waged. That's why it's got to be warfare. It can't be just policy. It can't be, we want these things. We'll bandstand. We'll hold some hearings. We'll talk loud. But but Representative Clyde's proposal is real. It's to shut down 2 things. Any prosecution, federal prosecution of any major presidential candidate before November 5th, 2024. Shut it down, no funding. The second is to shut down funding, federal funding, for any district that's not federal that is also engaged in a prosecution of a major presidential candidate. So they would strip funding from New York and Atlanta, basically, to put it simply, if those were to pass. Now, one, as I just mentioned, procedurally, you're going to have to fight that. That's going to be not just having them added as rider bills to the appropriations to one of the 12 bills. And that's partly what they've got to do. They've got to come back and pass all these bills by September 30th, or they've got to kick the can down the road till December 31st. But appropriations is on the front burner for Congress. So they've got to pass these. That means McCarthy would have to fight and insist that nothing leaves conference without those riders getting passed along with it. Meaning that then both chambers pass those riders and send it to the president. And then he can either veto the appropriations bill and not fund that entire section of government, or he has to sign it and pass it. You get a sense. There's a lot of hurdles here. Again, that's why it's not a question of bandstanding and passing these 2 things, but warfare. Even if it passed, we can all imagine that a bunch of 501c3 charities, political charities, this is how the entire Democratic Party operates today, charities that are set up to fund get out the vote, policy help, supporting elections. They're just outright political charities that are so-called to help the civic process. We all know what that is. It's a complete racket run by Zuckerbergs and billionaires and the Oprahs and the Obamas and the Eric Holders to basically run the election process to control it. So these kinds of charities could easily come in and privately fund these areas. Who knows? That's not the point. You need full-on pressure. And again, why impeaching Biden is a way for the rhinos to distract from the actual fight, the real fight around Trump, and to make it somehow about Biden and Biden's corruption. That may be all accurate, objectively true, but warfare is not just about shooting the enemy somewhere in the battle. It's about figuring out how you win the war, cutting the ability of the enemy to fight, breaking their will, making the punishment so severe they can't keep fighting. That's why we've called for the impeachment of Merrick Garland. Put pressure directly on the DOJ. And make it not about the election per se, but about the deep corruption that's been going on inside the Department of Justice, which is just rank. Now, are the Republicans smart enough to even handle that? We have yet to see that. But what we've called for last week, as I said, we're not the only ones. There is major pressure on many fronts. The point is to continue to escalate on this front. Trump's mugshot, the mugshot seen around the world, much like Trump's interview with Tucker, these are viewed by hundreds of millions of people, was a clear escalation, but something that blows back in the enemy's face. A growing number of Americans, but not just Americans, people worldwide. People might have seen this kind of viral music song by an artist, Oliver Anthony. Now, the most interesting thing to me, and if you haven't seen it, you can watch it. It's been viewed by like 30 million people. And he's just a guy living on a property out in Western Virginia, young kid, about 30. But that the YouTube comments are from people in Australia, Nigeria, the Netherlands, Canada, just all over the world, including all over the United States, black, white, everybody. Because the working class of the world is getting destroyed. COVID lockdowns destroyed the working class of the world. It shut down small businesses. There's one clear demographic divide in this country today, 50-50. 50%, or at least prior to COVID, 50% worked for small businesses, mom and pop shops, construction, plumbing firms, carpentry, electrician, construction, other small enterprises, and half work for large corporations. Well, we all know working for a large corporation is like working for some kind of strange pagan religion today, in terms of the hoops you have to go through and accept LGBT and all the rest. DEI training, that kind of thing. That's not happening at small mom and pop shops and small enterprises. But COVID came to crush this. It crushed the small businesses, crushed the working class generally. And the process has only continued and escalated. It was ongoing for decades, as we know. The 2008 crisis, the bailouts didn't go to the working class people of our country or in Europe or Japan or anywhere else where bailouts were happening. They went to large corporations, big insurance firms, big hedge funds, big banks, and so on. It bailed out the financial class, who had most of their investments in things like stocks, derivatives, the broader equity field. As Brian Lance points out, half of the investments today are in shadow banking, meaning in banking, in stock trades, in investments that are not public, that are private, that receive no public scrutiny, that aren't part of the Dow Jones or the New York Stock Exchange. In terms of trades, even of companies listed on the NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, but they're traded off the exchange. It's shadow banking. And this is really what the Federal Reserve at their Jackson Hole meeting is pushing. Let's just go more and more shadow banking, where there's no oversight, there's no regulation, or very little, if any. I mean, there's barely any of the actual public regulated banking system. So we can all imagine what's happening with these crooks. So in COVID lockdowns, it gives us a window into the way this global central banking cartel works. And part of how we can escalate in the face of these indictments, and more may be coming. Arizona, maybe we'll see things come from Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. They're just going to keep indicting Trump, keep sticking him in courts throughout the entire primary season, try to get him convicted of sedition, try to keep him off the ballot. But you're not going to win this. They're not going to win this in the courts, and neither are we. This is going to be waged in the streets, in the organizing dynamic of the American people. And the response, just from the mugshot alone, from across the working class, from a lot of the blacks in Atlanta who have family and friends who have spent time in the Fulton County Jail. Trump has gained great levels of sympathy because they realize the same people that have been destroying them and their families and their neighborhoods and their communities are now targeting Trump. It helped make the connection, because Trump really is the enemy of this global banking cartel. So my point then, the COVID lockdowns destroyed that working class here in the US, but around the world. It also printed huge amounts of money, huge amounts of money. We increased our money supply by 50%. It was something like $13 trillion in circulation. It went to something like $20 trillion just in the period of COVID of a year or two. And then people wonder why there's inflation. Oh, but no, inflation's not that bad. It's only like 3 or 4% now. This is what the Federal Reserve says. 3 or 4%. But food prices over the last 3 years, given the rates of inflation, which they're not talking that prices are going down by 3 or 4%. They're just only going up by 3 or 4%. Food prices over the last 3 years are 30% or more higher than they were like prior to COVID. Fuel prices, 30, 40% more than they were prior to COVID on average. These are things you have to pay for. You have to get to work. You have to buy the food. They talk about consumer price index and these various federal statistics. Manure, total manure, complete waste, just complete manipulation. The things that people are actually buying, that they have to buy, that they depend on, they're getting gouged. That means the wages in this country have dropped by 30% for most people in the last 3 years. Now, add to that the central banking cartel's response. And this is the Fed, this is the European Central Bank, it's Japan. Those are the main three. It's the Bank of England. Those are the big four central banks that have run this cartel operation. All the nations are sucked into it. All the BRICS nations are tied into this central banking program. China, Russia, all of them play games. China is a little bit different in some respects, but all of them are tied into the central banking system. Even if Russia's been pushed out of the banking system, they're still tied to a central banking cartel, a private control of currency, credit, and ultimately economic policy. It's psychotic. We hand this over to some grouping of so-called experts. Their response to this crisis has been to raise interest rates. House mortgage rates are now 7.5%. They're the highest they've been since 9/11. They were like 3%, 3.5% prior to COVID. And they were kept low during COVID, so all these people could go and buy houses. They were artificially suppressed. Just continuing to raise the prices. But that means the borrowing rate in general, if you're running a small enterprise, now if you're running a small company that's trying to produce manufacturing, industrial production, clothing, whatever you're producing, just something physical. It's not a financial transaction. It's not a private equity. It's not a merger and acquisition. If you're trying to keep your business going and borrowing from a local bank, if the bank is still around, you're borrowing at double, if not more, the borrowing cost of that if they'll loan to you. If the bank's still alive, if they'll loan to you, the price to pay back in terms of interest rates, the interest rates will have doubled. So these companies aren't borrowing. The cost is too high. So you're choking off who again? The working class, the industry, the production. You might be slowing down some financial transactions, but that really isn't the big concern, is it? The real concern is people's ability to have jobs, to have growth, to hire new people, to get the economy moving. So the response, but the inflation is not coming down because they raised rates. They've been raising rates now for almost a year and a half. The effect, nada. The prices are still going up. They don't even intend to bring prices down. ever. To them, that would be a catastrophe. Would it be a catastrophe to you? Probably not. If your food prices, if steak prices came down, would that be a catastrophe? Fuel prices, egg prices, milk, cheeses. Would that be a catastrophe? Be grade A, total positive thing for the American people. Never intended by this central banking cartel. Now, the way this cartel operates is through maintaining control over who's in political power. As well as creating conditions to where they can write off their debt. To basically say, well, all the debt we've accumulated, all these bad kind of the trash that's been built up from our waste and neglect and stupidity at running the world financial system for the last 50 years. We've got to get rid of, we got to clean this out somehow. We got to start from a new slate. We got to start over, clean. They need political reasons to be able to do that, and they need political power to make it happen, to execute it. That's what Hillary Clinton was supposed to do in 2016, 2017. We're even in a bigger crisis today, and they need MAGA Trump to go away. Trump's clearly a threat to that question of political power. He is the threat to this political power. And it undergirds even the danger of war. Ukraine thing has been a complete disaster. But why did they intend to create a war with Russia? Russia didn't want a war. Russia's been sitting there watching this conflict go on for 8 years. They didn't want a war. They thought if they threatened actual attack that they would get a response and say, okay, let's negotiate. We said no. Basically invade and then we'll respond. And the escalation's been step by step by step, more and more escalation. We want a war with Russia. Well, because wars are oftentimes, as long as you win them, and that's not always clear, but if they were to win this war against Russia, which they won't, this is what McGregor and others have always been clear on. We don't have the military, we can't even produce the shells that they need. I mean, they're just not going to, Ukraine can't win the war. Even a NATO army couldn't win the war. Even attempting to deploy the US military, the logistics of moving things from the East Coast into Europe to support the war, if we could produce them, would be obliterated in the Atlantic Ocean. And you wouldn't need, German submarines to do it any longer. You'd have precision guided missiles. This war is not going to be won. It may be lost by everyone in terms of a nuclear war, but they're pushing the war because if they were to win it, it would increasingly justify the ability to dump the trash upon the losers, to start a clean slate, and to say we can now reorganize on behalf of global central banking interests. The United States may default on its debt. It may just, but all of that would be to crush the population and working class. In essence, it'd be like a fire coming through and wiping out all of the working class as it did in Maui. And then there'd be no military or federal government response. You'd basically be given the middle finger. The news would never cover it. And the news would say, everything's great. The banks are healthy. Everything is fine. That's the intention of this global central banking cartel. And they are out to make sure Trump is destroyed. They have no other solution but to maintain political power, to wipe out their debts, to clean out their trash, to dump it on us. It's like taking the recycling, right? All the plastic bottles people think they're recycling, and then companies would collect that, and then they would take it over and sell it to China. China would literally take the trash, or other countries, and then not, because you can't process it. Nobody wants to process the plastic. It's just not worth it. So it's just a shell game. But they would run that shell game on the entire global population, just like they did with COVID. Oh, you've got to lock everybody down. Though everybody said you'd never lock everybody down. It's the worst thing to do. Now you had to. Because the intrinsic crisis is that these so-called experts are clueless. They have no idea how to address this economic breakdown, because there is only one clear solution. If you're going to actually support the population, you have to make a principled commitment to the population, not to your banking cartel. Your banking cartel is bankrupt. We can deal with that, but only under the circumstances of a principled commitment to the population. For all of Trump's faults or lacks or whatever that people and criticisms that people may have of him, he is totally committed to the American people. Why would he go through all of this? Why would he go through the mugshot? And what the mugshot represents and reflects is that commitment. And people are starting to see it. You know, it's funny, but you think of Bud Light and all the attacks. The American working class, Black, Hispanic, Indian, Asian, white, it doesn't matter. You're working class. You're trying to survive, raise your families, pay the bills, buy a home, make sure your kids have a viable future. This system isn't working. And the Lords of London in The Economist 2 months ago made it very clear that Trump's commitment to reorganize the administrative state will ultimately could very well include the Federal Reserve. It's absolutely accurate of The Economist to recognize that. Trump recognizes and acknowledges the independence of the Fed is absurd. Why? Why should they just be independent of the elected government? It's completely undemocratic. So not a hard argument to make. We've just been living with basically a bunch of narcissistic, a-holes for too long who would even justify that. And so the question of controlling interest rates. Now, going into the principles of a national bank and the principal distinction and how it would be structured, we can always get caught up in a lot of the details and how that works. But I want to give what I think is pedagogically an important sense of how an actual viable banking system, a national banking system, would function versus the current central banking commitment. Their intention is to serve an oligarchical interest, to support oligarchical power. One of the bankers, I think at JP Morgan, said the problem in 2008-9, this might have even been at the London conference. One of the first things Obama did was attend the London conference of the G8, promoting a global bailout regime in January of 2009. But it was a banker, I believe, from JP Morgan who said, the problem we have today is we have all these anti-fascist constitutions from post-World War II. So the ability to run the regime we want to run is just kind of complicated because these constitutions force us to maintain by law a commitment to the population. Oh, I know, such obstacles. So it's a commitment. It's an oligarchical commitment. But a way a real national banking system or a healthy banking system would work today, because you can't just lower interest rates, right? The idea of debating, well, higher interest rates to deal with inflation, but lower interest rates. If you just start going back to cheap money, all the money is going to rush back into more and more of the stocks and the equities and the financial transactions. Yes, it will allow companies to borrow and be productive a little bit more, but you are going to continue to have inflation. It may slow down a little bit still, but it's a false, it's to say, like, it's a false choice to say, well, do you want high interest rates or low interest rates? I want both. This is my pedagogical point. In a viable national banking system controlled and organized by our elected leaders, not controlled by them, but determined, the standards are set. You could have two different interest rates. If you are participating in financial transactions, M&As, equity, hedge funds, special purpose acquisition companies, the SPAC jacks like Paul Ryan, these total creeps, the private equity, buying up companies, breaking them into pieces, all of that, 8%, 9%, whatever. I don't care. Loan shark those guys to death. But that would be a separate interest rate, as high as we wanted to set it. Some of the activity may be useful in that area. Most of it's not. Choke it off. You can also tax it, but set a separate interest rate. But for people that are actually going to produce something, a state wants to build a highway, a bridge, a railroad, a water system, a nuclear power plant. Perfect example, a nuclear power plant. Well, guess what? They get to borrow it maybe 1%. Maybe nuclear power plants and critical energy infrastructure we would loan at 1%, and other things we would discount around, to 2 or 3%. So you'd have, for physical investments, large-scale infrastructure may be very low. A local plumbing firm wants to expand, buy more equipment, buy more trucks, more capability. They get 3%. You want to do a private equity SPAC deal, you get 15%. And you separate the difference. And so all of a sudden, you better be making sure. So all of a sudden, people say, well, I want to invest where the interest rates are low. And minimally, the people that want to get actual activity done that's going to hire people, be productive, be in manufacturing, are going to be rewarded. They're going to be able to do business and thrive. And the liquidity they need to get out there and do it, and the small and medium-sized banks that they use will then be borrowing that money from the Fed and then loaning it out nearly very cheap with a small raise in interest, like 0.5% or something. And that business moves. And the loan, all the private equity creeps, we basically loan shark them as a national policy. Now, I just want to make one more point. There was Tony Pappert's article on the BRICS is excellent, because part of the BRICS process, and we'll discuss this more on some of these calls, because I think Tony's point is really critical today. Iran, so the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they've been in operation for about 15 years. They just added 6 new countries, most of them in the Gulf, Red Sea area: Egypt and Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and then Argentina. So now it's now 11 countries, and they could certainly add another 6. Turkey, Indonesia, other nations are on the list that could join at some point. There's no alternative system here. This idea of what I just described, of a physical credit system for production, is intrinsic to the United States constitutional system. It is the American system. No other nation on earth is defined in this way, as we have been, as our system is set up. And it gives the dollar-based international system real life. It can be exploited. The central banks fund all the wars, and they fund all the government debt. That's part of their whole operation. Massive government debt, massive government bureaucracies, and major wars. That's what these bankers have been funding for thousands of years, basically. But the dollar-based system can be based on an American credit system. That means we have to have it here. These other nations are responding to the fact that, like with Russia, Russia was just kicked out with massive sanctions out of any kind of international banking system. And they see that this is just dysfunctional. And they're trying to create some level of stability, because they know that current operation, this global central banking cartel, cannot continue to function. People may preach it as anti-American, anti-US dollar, but they're living in fantasy land. You've got to deal with the real political fight, which is here at home. But in Tony's article, 2 younger guys, did an extensive study to say, how have nations gotten out of poverty? And have nations achieved that over the last 50 years? The only nation to have done it is China. All the other many nations advanced from 1960 to 1980. But then from 1980 on, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. Now, it's an extensive article. It's referenced there if you're really interested in how global development has worked and how it has been a catastrophe for the last 43 years. I really encourage you to read it, both Tony's and then this addendum article. But the point they draw is the same point we've made. Manufacturing is the only way to do it. You're not going to do it with IT. You're sure as hell not going to do it with services, massage therapy. You're not going to do it with gig work. These are disasters. You're not going to do it with commodities, just selling oil or soybeans. Failure, 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 failure. All global central banking cartel operations. The only way you'll do it is with manufacturing. And to do that means really they identify changing and they're actually leftists who wrote the paper, but they identify you have to bring manufacturing and industry back to the United States first. You have to have that kind of, they don't say it, but a credit system here. And the reason I bring that up is because it's an extensive study. They look at a lot of different nations and they draw the very same simple conclusions. In my mind, this is how we escalate on the fight with Trump, Agenda 47, and to continue to mobilize House Republicans. That, yes, they should wage the political fight, but they've got to make it clear that it's in the economic destruction of our country, which is why they're fighting. This is how you bring in that working class Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, whites, the working class people that have been destroyed under the COVID lockdowns and incompetence, who have been destroyed by central banking insanity, by the inflation, and want some sanity and structure and focus for a viable future. Trump represents this. He's more than capable of doing it, but he needs our backup to make sure we get it done. So that's what I wanted to present tonight. That's what I'm thinking. Certainly excited to see what you guys are thinking, given the intensity of the situation, and we can go from there. So Keisha, I'll hand it back to you and see what people have to say.